In a few days, we will share the recording on our Silmar website and Facebook. My name is Lan Jin. I'm the Intercultural Research Specialist from Silmar. Today, it's my great honor to invite Dr. Horan Holgate to present his Sea Grant research on exploring the associations between university instructors' intercultural orientations, students' experiences in the classroom, and educational outcomes. Dr. Horan Deanta Holgate received a BA in psychology and minor in sociology from Johnson C. Smith University and went on to earn a Master's of Science in Education degree and PhD in Educational Psychology and Research Methodology from Purdue. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Center for Instructional Excellence, CIE, and the College of Agriculture, Office of Multicultural Programs. Horan's main research interests intersect motivation theory, multicultural education, and intercultural development with respect to faculty development, cultivating inclusive classroom environments, and assessing student development of global competences. In today's webinar, Dr. Holgate will present his Sea Grant research first. Dr. Holgate told me that he's comfortable with taking questions during the presentation. So if you have questions, feel free to jump in by unmuting yourself. Then after the presentation, if we still have time, we will have a Q&A session. So you can either unmute yourself to ask questions at any time or type your questions in the chat, and then I can read these questions for you. Or we can address your questions in the Q&A session. Either will be fine. All right, I will turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Holgate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, or evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. I'll share my slide my screen. Everyone able to see now? Okay, perfect. Are you seeing like my video, or you're just seeing the slides? Just the slides, right? Okay, I see the video. Okay, on Zoom. Well, thank you everyone for coming. For the next few minutes, I'm just going to share a bit about some research that I conducted through the Silmar Seed Grant I received. This research was actually part of my dissertation, so I'm not necessarily presenting the whole thing, but more of sections of it, but I do try to give you a general frame of what was done and the results. So today we're going to start with kind of a brief activity, get the big picture, and then go over some literature and frameworks that I used, and then looking at the methods that I used, as well as the results and conclusions. And then if we have time, we'll do some reflection, but that's the general outline that we'll use. So I want you to, just a brief activity, to think about this and share for maybe 30 seconds to a minute, what is the mission and vision of higher education? And you feel free to post it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak. Dr. Jane, can you monitor the chat for me?
Sure. I think for me, the mission of higher education is to maximum student learning and growth.
Okay.
Any other thoughts? And we have some response in chat: preparing leaders, creating a better demography, sorry.
Okay. So we have leaders, preparing leaders, creating better democracy.
Yes.
Can I get two more?
Teach lifelong learning skills.
Lifelong learning skills. Growing interculturally competent people. Build on curiosity and exploration. But these are all very good. And I start with this just because I want to keep focus of the context of where higher education is right now. And that's really what sort of brought me to this work and the approach. that I took to it is that in university mission statements, you often see a lot of the things that you mentioned. And so we need to figure out whether or not we're doing it well and how we're actually going about doing that in effective ways, and then where we might need to change our approach in fulfilling the mission and vision of higher education. Okay, so for my project, I set out to examine instructors' intercultural orientation and perception towards cultural diversity, and how that relates in particular to student perceptions of the classroom environment and educational outcomes. And I decided to use an integrated theoretical and mixed methods approach, which I'll explain to you in a minute as to why I chose that particular approach based on the literature that I was seeing at the time. But first, some trends and shifts in higher education that really brought me to this. We think about internationalization and globalization and all the implications of that on student mobility, the competencies that students need to graduate, the change in from teacher-centered environments to more student or learner-centered environments. There's a shift in pedagogy in higher education over time. And then we're seeing this push towards inclusive excellence in research, service, teaching, and learning. And so these are all happening in higher education. And so the outworkings of that are that we need interculturally competent faculty, staff, student. We also need to be thinking about inclusive classrooms, campuses in general, and society. This has been a difficult year. 2020 just passed. And yes, racial justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion have always been a part of higher education, but we're seeing a sort of renewed focus with that. And so I put this here for us to begin to think about, okay, what are the implications of our research and our practice when it comes to particularly in the classroom context and higher education generally. So what all those trends and shifts mean is that now higher education, we want to focus on the atmosphere and the climate, valuing diversity, promoting inclusive excellence, preparing graduates to live in a global multicultural society, and using transformative and collaborative pedagogies in the classroom. So in the literature, we understand that teacher characteristics are important. The more interculturally competent instructors are, students, that's better for students in terms of their outcomes. When we incorporate diversity into our curriculum and make that explicit, it has positive effects on student learning. One thing that is often overlooked and what I hope to or set out to contribute is when we look at the classroom environment and student motivation in that classroom environment as it relates to those outcomes and making those the connections there with that. And that's not necessarily, I did not see much of that in intercultural development research, but my background is in educational psychology. And so we do some of that in educational psychology research specific to the classroom environment. So in my area in educational psychology, there's been a push towards culturalizing achievement motivation theory, integrating different approaches, methods, frameworks, particularly from multicultural education. And Christine Slater, a renowned scholar in multicultural education, and who talking about culturally responsive pedagogy and teaching, cited this clear need for evidence. Granted, this was in K through 12 context because a lot of cultural responsiveness research is in that area in K through 12, but we're seeing more and more where higher education is integrating a lot of these things. And there are some scholars who work on cultural responsiveness in classroom environment. So there are these gaps, and there are gaps, yes, but there are also opportunities that I think this is where I hope to contribute in the work. But there's been these calls for programs for faculty to develop their intercultural competence. And the second one in particular is how intercultural competence translate into teaching practices and pedagogical approaches. Sometimes we, from my experience, we don't necessarily have the look in the classroom because we use primarily surveys. And so there's not much observation. So that's one of the things I incorporated in this investigation to sort of see what was happening in the classroom, what were teachers doing, what were instructors doing of different intercultural orientations to get at some of those things. The theoretical and conceptual approach, like I mentioned, I draw on different frameworks within multicultural education, but then also psychological motivation theory and specifically self-determination theory. I see things in the chat. Oops. Is there a question in the chat? I can't access it directly. Okay.
No, no, it's approbation. That's all. We love you.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Where was I? All right. So we're looking at this theoretical and conceptual framing, where I'm looking at trying to intersect multicultural sort of approaches with psychological motivation theory. And specifically, I look at self-determination theory. And so my work functions as part of this project is at the intersection. And I'll briefly, just quickly go over these frameworks. I won't go in a lot of detail about them, but just to give you some context for the work was done and measures and outcomes and so on. So the diversity inclusivity framework identifies different elements of course design and implementation and when you look at it on a continuum, the degree to which different elements of the course are inclusive, right? So you'll see the image there and we'll get back to this in the results and so on. But that's basically the diversity inclusivity framework. Many of us would be familiar with this, the intercultural development continuum. And then the AAC&U intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, which looks at attitude, skills, and knowledge. I don't know how many people are familiar with cultural responsive teaching. I put the whole title because you see different words used there. I shorten it, just call it CRPTE. And what this looks at is it treats the classroom environment as a space where when students' perspectives are brought into the classroom intentionally, the outcomes of that are that they're more engaged in learning, and it's also about collective empowerment to reach a lot of those outcomes. So in defining culturally responsive classrooms, this is a sort of definition I use, and I want to point out here the fact that you may have a classroom where all students may be from a similar background, for example, but that doesn't mean that classroom environment cannot be culturally responsive. And sometimes we see approaches to culturally responsive pedagogy or teaching that simply take one lens towards it, where it's just looking at students from underrepresented backgrounds or different things like that. So it's more of, we think of heterogeneous classrooms, but we also have to consider homogeneous classrooms. Through this work, I've identified 4 components of culturally responsive classroom based on a review of the different frameworks. Inclusiveness has to do with the relationships in the classroom, whether they're equitable or respectful. Sociocritical consciousness, whether you're reflecting on aspects of the society inequities. Cultural inclusion, representing students' language, different perspectives, integrating that into the content, and diverse pedagogical practices, just like the name suggests, with their assessments, formative, summative, collaborative techniques are being used. Self-determination theory, this is a macro theory of human motivation and development. And the basic assumption is that human beings have 3 basic psychological needs. And when we structure environments in ways that nurture those needs, we get positive outcomes for students in different areas. But not just students, but in general for humans. Distinguishes between motivational orientation, where it's autonomous motivation, versus controlled forms of motivation. And motivation is seen as on a continuum. And so it's not just about the quantity of motivation that a person has, but it's about the quality of the motivation. So if you think of a classroom that would be controlling, in a sense, from self-determination theory perspective, they'd be largely focused on extrinsic rewards that are more external regulation as well as introjected, as opposed to being more what it describes as autonomous, identified, being valuing, and being a part of who the person is. And then intrinsic motivation just talks about it just being fun. It's a great, you enjoy that, you do it for the sake. So in taking both these perspectives in mind, so I sort of approach this work coming from the sense of we're integrating these perspectives, looking at the relationship between instructors' intercultural orientations, the social context, and the educational outcomes. And so let me just put all of these up. The assumption that I'm making is that the instructor's degree of understanding and value of cultural diversity, as well as their motivational orientation, that impacts the types of environments they create, and that has implications for the learning outcomes. But then there's this other aspect to it where I'm sort of hypothesizing this, is that when we understand students' experiences in the classroom a bit better and use that information, could that possibly lead to changes in instructors' intercultural orientation, as well as their motivational orientation? Because students, they're receiving this feedback from students, and we're understanding what students are experiencing in their classrooms. I don't particularly look at this backward sense in this particular investigation, but just as part of conceptualization that is there. So I had 4 specific research questions. The first 2 here are on the more quantitative side, because I'm using a mixed methods approach, looking at intercultural competence, diversity, inclusivity as it relates to the classroom environment, and then intercultural competence and diversity inclusivity in terms of these educational outcomes, academic motivation, achievement, and intercultural knowledge and competence. Achievement, in this sense, I use the construct of the student's anticipated grades in the course, or what the student basically expected to get in the class. And then on the other side of it, more qualitative focus, how do instructors address culture and diversity as they're creating their course and in their classroom environments? And also looking at the 4th question, actually, in this case, second for the qualitative strand, whether or not there's an alignment between what instructors set out to do, or what they intend to do, and what students actually experience in the classroom. Because it's possible that an instructor might set out to create a sort of environment, they're using different strategies, but students are experiencing something totally different. And so there may be a mismatch. And so is there an alignment there? Any questions so far? Everyone tracking with me? Good. Okay, I see a question for the end, but yeah, we'll get there. So the methods, oh dear. Okay, here we are. So I used the convergent mixed methods design, and what this design allowed me to do is that I would be able to collect the quantitative and the qualitative data simultaneously throughout the process. Some other mixed method designs use sequential, so quant first, then qual, or qual, then quant. But because of the limited amount of time, I needed to gather all the data, and this design allowed me to do that. So on the research questions 1 and 2, as it relates to the quantitative strand, research questions 3 and 4, as you just saw, relate to the qualitative strand. So what I did, some methods that I use, questionnaires, instructors and students filled out questionnaires. For the qualitative strand, I conducted focus groups. There's this method called SIGID, Small Group Instructional Diagnosis. It's sort of a small focus group with students. So I modified that approach to involve not only what was helping students learning or what hindered their learning, but also the extent to which they were learning about cultural awareness, self and others, in the classroom. And so the students would reflect on that. I also conducted 3 classroom observations throughout the semester, 1 at the beginning, 1 in the middle, and 1 towards the end of the semester. I used the intercultural development inventory as my measure. I'll show you those in a minute. So I conducted individual debriefs with faculty who agreed to participate in that section of the investigation, as well as a semi-structured interview. I also reviewed their course materials. I see. So for data analysis, I'm using for the qualitative strand, it's more of a case study approach, multiple case study design. So looking at within classrooms what is happening, and then across the classrooms. Then we'll look at the results and so on in a moment, but it's sort of presenting the quantitative and the qualitative kind of separately. This is how the analysis was done, and then integrating that to form a whole in understanding the research objective that I laid out in the beginning. The relationship, or the association rather, between orientations towards cultural diversity and classroom environment and educational outcomes. So these were the specific variables that I looked at and the measures that I used. I won't read them to you, but instruments that you may not be familiar with. For the academic motivation scale, a sample item is there. So students respond to this questionnaire asking them, I study for this class because, so it's assessing their motivation at different levels based on the self-determination theory continuum I shared earlier. Then the learning climate questionnaire is assessing the autonomy supportiveness of the classroom environment, the degree to which students perceive that their psychological needs for autonomy, competence, relatedness are satisfied. There's a sample item there. Cultural responsiveness scale. This is one that I developed through reviews, and then validation is ongoing. My instructor used examples. This in particular is related to the component of cultural inclusion in the classroom. And then ASK was developed based on the intercultural knowledge and competence AAC and U value rubric. And the sample statement there is based on reserving judgment openness, attitude openness. So the research context, large 4-year research intensive university in the Midwest. So as a large university, data collection was done during the fall and spring semester, 2018 to 19. So this is just basic demographics of, or a broad context, big picture of the research context. Just to make sure I'm good on time. The sample, so I had 11 instructors who responded, but I had to allow students to, sorry, not students, but instructors to opt in to the classroom observations, as well as their students participating in the survey. That was difficult to come by, but 3 instructors agreed to participate. So I gave them a chance to choose. While some instructors would complete the IDI, they wouldn't allow their students to necessarily participate. The analysis that I will show you, though, only involves those instructors who their students also participated. So I do have more instructors who completed the IDI and so on, but they're not included in this. They come from a range of academic disciplines and positions and ranks in the university. The demographics, student demographics, 2 notes right here. Ethnic identity, I allowed students to basically report. So I didn't give them a list of their ethnicity or their race or anything like that. So they reported those things, and then based on what they report, I created this construct of ethnic identity combining the ethnicity that they reported and the nationality. And so that's why that approach. For gender, they also reported that in text, and then it was coded. So male, female, that's just how participants identified, self-identified in the sample. Okay, I'm gonna pause briefly here. Any questions so far? Just to make sure that. Okay. So I'll start with the quantitative results. So these are descriptive statistics. So looking at intercultural competence and diversity inclusivity, I assigned groups created groups, 3 groups, based on the instructor's developmental orientation scores, as well as their perceived orientation scores from the IDI. And so using the IDC continuum as the basis for these things. So the monocultural, minimization, and intercultural. The IDI scores are there, so you can see the different ranges of where instructors are. Those highlighted, as you see, are those instructors that participate in the case study with their students. The diversity inclusivity looked basically divided it into high diversity inclusivity versus low diversity inclusivity. And for for this one, it's based on the fact that whether or not the instructor responded with the mean was above 3 or above or below 3. So if you look at the table, what you see is that there's a range, basically in terms of an instructor may have a combination of having a monocultural, for example, instructor C, monocultural intercultural orientation, but in terms of including diversity inclusivity in their course, that was high. And that is an interesting dynamic. And there's also this range when you consider developmental orientation of minimization with low diversity inclusivity. So an instructor who is not really including much diversity inclusivity in their course. Generally across the group, the 11 instructors, that is, so on average, the instructors fell in perceived orientation was sort of in acceptance. So that's where they perceive themselves to be based on the IDI. And we can think about the implications of, okay, what would that look like in the classroom, an instructor with this orientation? So an instructor, basically what the instructor is sort of communicating about themselves. And this is general descriptions based on the acceptance orientation from the IDI, is that they're able to do all of these things, or they have this level of awareness, their perceived orientation. But we know that the IDI presents the developmental orientation, and where they, based on the scores, generally, it would be in sort of on average across this group of 11 instructors, they'll be in minimization. And so these are basically descriptors of what maybe their approach to teaching and learning in the classroom and how they might be operating. Okay. Oops. So when it comes to diversity inclusivity, so what you're seeing here is the diversity inclusivity framework and how varied, how instructors responded to statements. So instructors were responding to the statement, the extent to which they did this in their course. So for purpose and goals, students gain an understanding of different topics, course and context, and it goes through each one of that. So I'll highlight a few things right here. When it comes to integrating diversity inclusivity in the purpose and goals, see that was happening very little, but very little some. So it's on the lower end. When it comes to content, that's less. And then instructors even themselves exploring their own scholarly or potential biases related to their course content, that was happening very little. Foundations and perspective, that happened quite a bit. They're reporting that they were doing that quite a bit in their course. Still following the diversity inclusivity framework. And so when it came to like assuming learner's perspective, that was happening quite a bit in the courses. Pedagogy, quite a bit. Classroom environment. So you see the range in how instructors are including or addressing diversity inclusivity in their course. And an interesting, what I extracted from this, or what I was able to see from this, is that, so one, instructors with different developmental orientations cover a range in diversity inclusivity. There's a gap between their perceived and developmental orientations, but we see that instructors are including diversity inclusivity in their courses, even considering their different intercultural orientations. But when it comes to diversity inclusivity, the emphasis is primarily on the teaching practices and less on the grounding, the foundations or the grounding of their course material. So going back, thinking about the purpose and goals. So diversity is not explicit in that aspect of the course. The instructor themselves are not actively reflecting on things related to diversity inclusivity. But we do see that they are at least engaging in some inclusive practices. So in these slides, what I'll show here is the relationship, or the association rather, between intercultural competence and perceptions of the classroom environment. And so here you see that in terms of cultural responsiveness, students in, now I have to make sure I get the language right here. So instructors who are more interculturally competent, students perceive the classroom environment to be more culturally responsive when you compare them across the different intercultural orientations, as well as autonomy support. So higher degree of not cultural responsiveness, intercultural development does relate to more cultural responsiveness. So for example, you look at students perceive the classroom environment to be more culturally responsive versus compared to instructors in minimization, monocultural orientations. So I want to highlight one thing here as it relates to sociocritical consciousness. This is an aspect of the culturally responsive classroom environment. And this aspect, you'll see the differences here with instructors or students' perception of sociocritical consciousness in their classroom with instructors who are in monocultural and minimization mindset. When you compare that with instructors who are in the intercultural mindset. So there's no difference in terms of students' perceptions of sociocritical consciousness here, but there is some difference when you look at the intercultural orientation, and we would expect this in a sense, because the classroom in this type of classroom environment, the instructor you'd expect to be doing different, be engaged in practices that promote sociocritical consciousness. And when it comes to motivation and other educational outcomes, instructors who are more interculturally competent, that also translates into students perceiving the classroom environment to be more autonomously motivated. They perceive more autonomous motivation, better quality of motivation. Intercultural development and competence also is significant for the instructors with intercultural orientation. So that means students are perceiving that they're developing intercultural attitudes, skills, and knowledge. For diversity inclusivity, no difference in terms of when you look at students' perceptions of where it's high diversity inclusivity or low diversity inclusivity when it comes to autonomy support, cultural responsiveness, or academic competence, but diversity inclusivity in terms of high or low matters when students perceive intercultural development, more development of intercultural attitude, skills, and knowledge, and they perceive the environment, specifically the aspect of sociocritical consciousness when diversity inclusivity is addressed. So thinking about these results in particular, the two things that we really have to consider is that instructors' orientation towards cultural differences, their intercultural competence, and diversity inclusivity, yes, we know they matter, but they matter in what ways? In what specific ways? When we think of the outcomes that we mentioned, it's important for intercultural development outcomes, as well as from a classroom environment perspective, sociocritical consciousness. So take a look at the qualitative results, and here I'll just briefly go over this. This was sort of the procedure that I used to go through the data. Validation and trustworthiness, I used primarily a triangulation approach. So peer feedback, looking at students' focus group responses from my classroom observations, as well as the survey responses, and then reflection journals and memos. This gives you an example of the profile of the classroom. So the first case, there were 21 students enrolled, but only 12 participated. Case 2, 23, 16 participated. Case 3, it's a larger class. So there's a range in the class, somewhat of a range in the class sizes. And most of these classes were classes who are from the liberal arts, social and behavioral sciences discipline. So these are the 3 cases: participants, instructors who chose to participate in this aspect of the study, where they're, but others like in math, statistics, and so on, those did not choose to have their students participate. So in looking at the 3 cases, I identified 3 sort of approaches or ways that instructors were addressing culture and diversity in their courses, or sort of profiles for these instructors. Some were proactive, somewhat explicit and intentional. They're proactive, very explicit, and then somewhat reactive, somewhat explicit and pragmatic. So these represent different ways in which instructors were addressing, or profiles for instructors were addressing cultural diversity in their courses. And I'll give you some examples of that in the individual classes. And then looking at the classroom environment and the fostering relationships, giving student voice and choice. And these were developed based on autonomy, support, and cultural responsiveness. So sorry, is there a question? Oh, okay, sorry, I thought there was a question. So the 3 themes below represent aspects of the classroom environment. So what the classroom environment looks like that actually supports students psychologically, as well as their cultural backgrounds. Now I have to do this again. So think of instructor case 1, different approaches to varying degrees. So this instructor, in this particular case, they're at high diversity inclusivity. Oh, I thought I heard someone. High diversity inclusivity, but they were more proactive. An example of this is based on what they think about when they sit down to create their course. So an instructor who is proactive, I described this instructor or this classroom environment as proactive, somewhat explicit, and intentional for case 1. And then an instructor, what they're thinking about when they sit down to create their course, this is more in a more explicit approach, more proactive, very intentional. For the classification instructor 3, reactive. So in terms of addressing thinking about cultural diversity when sitting down to prepare the course, it's more of a reactive focus. So it's not something that they consciously think about. But there is some aspect to it that is very explicit and pragmatic, in the sense that the instructor is actually considering whether or not their assessments are actually equitable and fair. So these are just samples that represent the different orientations of the instructors and how they create their course. Thinking about the course syllabus, and so I reviewed the different course syllabi and looked at statements in the syllabus. So, for example, in diversity statements, instructor who was more proactive, somewhat explicit, had information from the university sort of statement, but instructor who was, for example, case 2, who was more explicit and intentional, had language in their own term, they incorporated language about diversity in their syllabus from their own perspective. But other aspects that reflect this sort of orientation to including diversity, inclusivity explicitly in their course have to do with accessibility and how the different instructors approach that. So across the instructors, you see the use of language here in the course syllabus in sort of creating the environment varies based on, even though they're all high in diversity, inclusivity, and they vary in the intercultural orientation, they have different approaches in addressing these things in the course. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
just want to make sure if our audience has any questions before we run out of time because we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to make sure any questions from our participants.
I don't know if this will be, I'm sorry, I need to turn on my video. Okay. Pam, sorry, she heard hers. I'm wondering if this is more appropriate for later, but I'm wondering if there is a tie between also demographics of the instructor with the focus on high diversity and inclusivity in terms of proactive versus reactive.
Can you say that again?
Oh, I'm wondering if there is connection or correlation between the demographics of the instructors, especially racial makeup of the instructors, and the approach to the diversity in this classroom.
That is an interesting question. So because I didn't necessarily set out to look at that, I didn't really capture. I didn't look at that relationship. But to give you some context for for example, case one, the instructor for this course, male. The instructor for the course is male, white male, Anglo background. So I hesitate to put so much emphasis right in this moment on that, but I do believe that is an important factor. But I didn't necessarily consider that as part of this particular analysis in that sense. But those two things would be somewhat related. But for example, across these three cases, we have 2 males, 1 female. Case 3, male. Case 1, also male. Case 2, female. And in terms of background, case 1 and 3 are both Caucasian white males, and case 2 would be an international female from an international background. Does that sort of help you get a flavor for this, or a frame of reference for this? So being conscious of time, I'm going to look at just some of what I saw in terms of the different aspects of the classroom environment from the instructor. So what instructors tried to do in terms of fostering relationships, what happened in their classroom. So instructor K responds that she tries to get everyone to be able to talk in the class and relate with one another. And while students generally, in the sense, perceive that in the classroom, and I also observed that in the classroom as well. So what the instructor was trying to do, that is, students actually perceived that, and I actually observed that in the classroom. But many instructors may experience this, where sometimes students may not relate. So the instructor's goals did not actually, students did not necessarily want to or engage with that. And so instructor had to use different strategies to adjust. Fostering relationships. So in the instructor H started this conversation on the first day of class in terms of how they would relate with one another. And thinking about this instructor's particular orientation, their approach, which was very explicit and practical, was different than the others. And the activities that they used in their classes had a lot to do with name tents. So it was very explicit about students getting to know one another, as well as getting to interact with them. Sorry, I'm moving so fast through these, but I'm gonna wrap up this in a sec. Instructor C, this approach is, as you saw, a bit more reactive, but it's not as explicit that they try to foster relationships. And one thing that I want to point out here in terms of context is very key. This is a large lecture course. And so this was not something that was easily, but when from students' perspectives, this was what the instructor was doing was somewhat engaging and actually leading to what they wanted, but they wanted more of that. And that's what I observed in the class as well. So I'm gonna stop here. I do have a lot, but I wanna advance to some of the main findings and conclusions, just because I want us to have some sort of engagement. So generally speaking, most instructors are not as interculturally competent as they think they are, but they are making efforts to address diversity in their courses and in their classrooms. And students perceive classroom environment, motivation, study intercultural knowledge and competence, and expect their grades. That's associated with more interculturally competent instructors. The last one, instructors are considering culture and diversity in their course design, just in different aspects and to varying degrees. And some of the, before I get to the implications, when we consider these specific findings and conclusions, the things that we have to consider are the fact that when we approach instructors to sort of faculty development, not necessarily thinking about that they're not doing anything, assuming their intercultural orientation or anything like that, based on, for example, the IDI that was used, but looking at other aspects that they may be doing these things already, and how can we move them along in specific areas in their classes. Obviously, this data was not representative of all universities, and then there's the aspect of self-selection of cases, which could potentially bias the results. But in looking at the fact that there was a range and the methods that I used in terms of triangulation with the different sources, that sort of helped, I think, to bring out the essence of what was there. The implications of this sort of approach is that not thinking about intercultural development just from the using intercultural development or multicultural frameworks, but how can we extend into other areas and other disciplines and other approaches to get a more fuller understanding of what's happening in the classrooms to meet the mission and vision of higher education. Looking specifically at the classroom environment and the practices that either support or undermine students' well-being, motivation, and intercultural learning outcomes. The second one, we know diversity courses are helpful. Study abroad is great, but moving along towards helping instructors develop and this mindset towards embedding intercultural outcomes throughout the curriculum and into their courses specifically, explicitly. We see that instructors in this case were not really doing that in terms of their purpose and goals. And so thinking about those specific things. Sorry, we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to acknowledge my dissertation committee and Silmar for the grant, and colleagues in the Center for Instructional Excellence who offered feedback and helped with the different processes in coming up with this project, funding the project, as well as the impact. Also, the students and instructors who participated, even though students were compensated, faculty, they were very, I guess, open with their time and allowing me to do this in their class. So I'm gonna stop here and we can have a discussion, or I can take questions and I can go back through anything that, any concerns that people may have.
Yeah, thank you, Horain.
Not concerns, questions. Or concerns, those are also welcome.
Yeah, thanks for this wonderful presentation. And we have 9 minutes for our Q&A session. Any questions or comments for Horain?
I'll go ahead and go first. Thank you, Horain. This is really fascinating work and so needed, because a lot of times we make assumptions about all these relationships, and to see it in the data is really interesting. So my question is, can you talk a little bit more about the self-selection and the potential bias there? Because maybe I'm just cynical, but I'm thinking in my mind, you know, if I were a person that's sort of uninterested in these kinds of things, I probably wouldn't sign up for a study like this. And maybe even worse, if I, you know, were somebody who deep down knew that I wasn't inclusive and had some prejudices or whatever, I would probably run in the opposite direction from a study like this. Right?
Yeah, so that self-selection, that's definitely a factor. And I didn't mention this throughout, but in terms of recruitment, the approach conceptually, I presented the arrow going the other way in the framework. I'll go to that slide. And that was a key part of this. So in recruiting faculty, I chose those who may be interested, who have participated in some sort of professional development in their course specifically, not necessarily related to intercultural development, so that they were interested in their overall course. And majority of the instructors are generally, and you saw how that reflected in the participants, the instructors, right? So it was graduate TAs, continuing lecturers, not so much tenured faculty, and so on. And make of that whatever we want to in terms of their commitment to teaching and learning, but that does present I'd say an opportunity for us to think about how do we approach these individuals who they teach students, they're a part of it, they're expected to help fulfill the university mission and vision, to actually engage in this, not as so much, oh, we're going to develop your intercultural competence, but how do we provide tools and ways for you to become a more effective instructor, professor. So that's, yes, the bias is definitely there, and particularly for this sample, but it does speak, I think, to some ways that we can approach it. And so my approach was to help faculty think about, in the recruitment, help faculty think about, okay, how can you use the information that you'll get from your students to actually change and improve your course? And so that part is key. And so the arrow going back, it's more of I didn't explore this, but it's more of a hope that when instructors see that, okay, this is my intention and this is what is actually happening in my class, they would reflect on that information. Not just on, that's why it's important that we consider both the psychological, the pedagogical, and those things, but also the cultural side and explicitly assessing that. When we explicitly assess that, then instructors will have that information.
Any other questions?
Hi, Horain. Thank you for that presentation. So I am, I totally feel and agree that, on your last slide, you said that there shouldn't be, that this should be embedded in courses, right? Do you have any particular resources that you feel are particularly good for instructors where you could direct them to who are trying to do this? Embed intercultural learning into their course?
Their courses. One thing, the diversity inclusivity framework that I include here, I think is a good way to start. To say to us, for the instructor to assess their syllabus and their course in terms of, look at their goals. What is and I'll pull that slide up because I think that would be a good starting resource for reflection. So starting with your course goals, going through your own course syllabus to say, okay, where am I on this continuum? Where is my course? Where would it fit? And then having done that, to now then connect with the different, here at Purdue, we have Silmar, who does a wonderful job of presenting all these different resources and departments. But I would say some sort of self-assessment of your own course and where you are, starting with this framework would definitely help and start the process toward that, because you'd have that information to see where you are.
Okay, thank you.
And I just want to add that to respond to Lata's question, Chris or Annette, do you know whether we have any resources that in our HubCo that instructors can use to embed diversity inclusivity into their course?
I don't think that there's a collection or anything like that specifically on this. Annette can correct me if I'm wrong. But, I think in addition to providing resources, I think, maybe a community of practice or, a series of dialogues or something on this would be good, because I think people need to talk through their practices and to think with each other about the applications, and not just have a series of tools that they can pull, although there is value in that. And so what I would love to see happen is that very thing, is people coming together and putting these things into practice, in addition to just having resources that are available for people to engage with individually.
I would say two things in addition to that on the hub is that you can search. You have to go into the event search functions for things that are useful in diversity and inclusion. So those could be tools, or those could be assessment. You can also search on tags like racial justice. And we have a new collection on assessment for social justice, which is not diversity inclusivity exactly, but it's certainly related.
Yeah, that's a really good point, to do a search of tags, because those are embedded pretty thoroughly within the Hubble, and they'll pull up resources from all areas, not just in the toolbox, but in the collections, in the publications area, throughout the Hubble, based on those tags. So at the top menu under Discover, you can go to tags and do searches that way.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris and Catherine, for your suggestions. Any other questions?
Just say one comment related to the conversation we're having. The fact that the question that Dr. Krishnan raised, I think, is an important one, and the response in terms of community. So do we currently have any communities of practice or reading groups or different things like that for faculty to be able to read a resource, a book on these things, and then make their own adjustments to the course? What are we currently doing? And do we need to create something along those lines for faculty who may want to start doing this more, embedding it in their courses?
Yeah, I'm imagining something, the active learning community practice has been fairly well engaged in from across campus. And if that could be a model for something like this, where people who are interested can work with a cohort, to develop their capacity for this, and what their curriculum actually looks like, and what their practices in the classroom look like, and together get support for that.
Yeah,
I would add to that also, Horain pointed out that they were mostly TAs, graduate instructors, one associate professor. Like, how do we get tenured professors or professors with lots of years of experience under their belt interested in this?
I mean, that I think is the big question. And there's not a one size fit all approach. I know one of the things I experienced was that is timing of faculty, the faculty not having the time. But I would say one way is when we think of the tenure and promotion process, and whether or not, how do we integrate DEI outcomes as part of tenure review process? So those who are moving along those lines, who know they need to get there, will sort of develop this mindset and this culture that these are things that I have to be integrating. And those who already have tenure, what from an administrative standpoint do we do about the culture of departments and university departments and colleges, to then say, okay, our strategic plan has these outcomes in there, and we want all faculty to be that. So it's building a culture around these things within departments, within colleges, and hopefully across the university, the campuses. But it has to, I think, start in departments where faculty are engaging with one another and they're seeing and relating these things, relating with these things.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are running out of time. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact Dr. Horain Holgate or me. We will post a recording of the webinar on our SUMAR website and Facebook. And again, I would like to thank you again to Dr. Holgate for this interesting talk and to audience for your active participation.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity
Ella.
to share.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.